I should issue a bit of a language warning for their website, but if you can get past the fruity language, you will learn a lot about what needs to be done to better protect nature and forests in Victoria. And now let me introduce you to our fabulous two speakers tonight, Associate Professor Philip Zylstra and Senior Environmental Lawyer Natalie Hogan. Phil is the Adjunct Professor at Curtin University, Visiting Fellow at the ANU's Fenner School, and a member of the West Australian-based Lewin Group. As you will soon see, Phil is an engaging speaker with a wealth of knowledge. He synthesises his experiences in remote area firefighting and management with the extensive research he has conducted into the factors that influence fire behaviour. So he speaks with both practical and academic authority. Phil has developed a peer-reviewed fire behaviour model for Australian forests. That model has been tested in the field and produced evidence that explains a lot of what we are seeing regarding the flammability of forests, and also exposes as myth the received wisdom that informs much of our official fire management policies and practices. He will talk to us tonight about that fire behaviour model, and hopefully we'll also have some time to discuss some of the traditional fire knowledge that has been shared with him by Indigenous knowledge holders. We're incredibly grateful that Phil agreed to travel down from New South Wales with some assistance from Patagonia to speak to us tonight. And as well as covering the science of forest protection in this event tonight, we also wanted the presentation to explain the confusing legal landscape that's allowed industrial logging to continue in Victoria despite its official end in 2024. When we asked around which legal expert we should invite to speak on that topic, everyone nominated our second speaker, Natalie Hogan. Natalie is a senior lawyer within...
course over time, and the more data points you've got there, the better the line you've got. And when you've got 65,000 years of data points, you've got a pretty good line put together. And so my understanding is that we've got this incredible knowledge base in First Nations. And anything that I'm doing now should start to converge with that understanding if I'm on the right track. And so I refer back to First Nations knowledge, not because I see myself as any sort of expert, but because people have been generous enough to tell me some of these things over the years, and now they're clicking. Now I'm seeing how it works. One of those people was Uncle Rod Mason. Now just let me get my projection up here. We're right. This area is called Wadbilliga. Wadbilliga means ribbon gums. Uncle Rod, as a kid, his family would travel up from the New South Wales south coast, and they'd climb the coastal escarpment, cross the top of the range, and they'd camp at this site here, and they'd dance on that little flat area there where it's just a little swampy bit there, but it's not always wet. But and they'd camp around this area. And it's at the base of a mountain called Dillagumbra. Dillagumbra is the rainmaker for the area. It's about 1,200 metres high, drops straight down to the coast. And so you get this orographic lifting, it's called, where you get the coastal winds blowing in there. And so it's a really wet, high rainfall area. So they know they've come into rain country, into Dillagumbra's country. And they stay camped there during the spring. Before crossing the Monero grasslands over to Tidbilliga, which is the old country, the snowy mountains, and they spend the summer in the snowies and then come back to Wadbilliga again in the autumn. But while they camp there in the spring, everybody's got something called bagal, which is kinship. You have kinship with a plant or an animal. People who had kinship with matruk, which is Acacia dilbata, it's a common wattle around. People who had kinship with matruk would watch, and when the flowers dropped, they'd come back into the group and they'd say the flowers have dropped. And then the men who had kinship with rain, with Dillagumbra, they would watch Dillagumbra for the day that he got cloud on his head, And when that happened, they'd leave their campsite, walk up the hill, and they'd call out, "Budiri Dilagamo," your country's good, Dilagambra. And they'd thank him by throwing a fire stick out into the bush and walking away. Now, if you're, say one of the first British moving into that area, and you were progressive enough to want to know what they did with fire, and you said to them, "What do you do with fire?" the answer would be, "Well, every year we throw a fire stick out there." Because that's the answer to your question. But that's not how an oral knowledge system works, because you've got this distributed knowledge. You need to have the person who's got kinship with Matruk, and the other person who's got kinship with Dilagambra, with Rainmaker, and the people who know the stories for that land. And once all of those threads come together, then what you have is a story that says it's only this specific time of the year when the flowers are dropping off Acacia dilbata. And it's only when you've got an easterly that is pushing this wind up the escarpment and forming that cloud on the top of a 1,200 metre high mountain, and there's the dew point, and there's an exact dew point. So now we've got an exact burning prescription, and that is that we throw this fire stick out with a single point ignition on the top of a hill. And then in half an hour, that wet wind from the coast blows across and puts this fire out. And so you get a patch burning maybe half the size of this hallway, less than that. Just a tiny little patch that's burnt. That's your burn program for the year, for that site. And what it does is that it means that there are a series of shrubs that grow around this site. Uncle Rod would point these out to me, and he said, "You won't find these anywhere else out in the bush. They're only around this campsite." And the reason for that is that every autumn we'd come back from Tidbilliga, with a whole store of the fruit from these shrubs for crossing the grasslands, and then when we got back here, we'd eat it and spit the seeds out for 10,000 years. And so you see it growing around here, and then we count on the fact that we've got a thick sward of shrubs growing all around this site here, all full of that fruit there, ready to feed us when we come back in the autumn. Now, if you look at that picture, it's no longer a thick sward. In fact, it's really hard to pick out any of those food shrubs, different pesunias and others in there. They're not thick on the ground anymore. And that's because it's just a process of ecology that there's a general rule. A bloke called Ray Specht came up with this general rule that each spot on the ground has got a budget of light and rain and nutrients. You can only grow so much there. And if it's full of trees and big plants that are taking the light and with big root systems taking the water and the nutrients, then there's not room for a whole lot of shrubs. If you want a whole lot of smaller things like shrubs, then what you need to do is let some light in, and you need to get some nutrients freed up and some water freed up. And so if you burn it, you free up some of those nutrients. You get some ash into the soil, and you stimulate those seeds to germinate. And that's how you maintain a dense shrub layer. And so that's what they're doing. And if they burnt it the wrong way, if they burnt it too much, they'd have no food to come back to in the autumn. And if they didn't burn it enough, then you weren't maintaining the dense layer of these food-producing shrubs that you needed. Can you hear how clever that is? Just how much information is contained in those few simple stories. And I'm very confident there's a whole lot more. But that's the little bit Uncle Rod was prepared to tell me and for me to pass on. So the other part of that is that by burning that little spot there, they're not disturbing the whole landscape. When you see a lyrebird at work, a lyrebird moves through country and digs up a little mound here and there, and they're working that patch of country. But what they're not doing is digging up the whole landscape. They're digging up the bit that they need. And this is the whole thing in being a community that is there for the long term. Your thinking is, we don't need to alter this whole landscape to suit us. I'm just going to take my little bit. and I'm going to share it with the others because I have kinship with these other species. I'm not here to dominate them. I'm not here to subdue them. I'm here as one of them. So, what drives flammability? Popular idea is that it's just about the amount of stuff that burns. Take out the fuel load. And so what it does is it obligates us to do something that's, the buzzword is active management. We've got to be active. We've got to be seen to be doing something, taking a firm hand, controlling things. So fuel, where did this idea come from that more fuel means more severe fires? Well, it seems like it. If you put another log on the fire, your fire gets bigger, but a bushfire is not organised like that. This graph is the basis of Australian fire management. It's 9 data points in a leaflet that say if you double the fuel load, you double the rate of spread. We don't know where the data is for those points. We don't have any further information. All we've got is that as the basis of the purpose for prescribed burning. Now, it's been investigated, but first of all, the reason that's significant is that litter loads, the leaf litter on the forest floor, the mulch, that makes up the main weight of fuel. And so this theory says that the more mulch there is, the more flammable the bush is. And the mulch builds up over time and it flattens out. The problem is that we know it isn't true. And we've known this for decades. Numerous of experiments have investigated this. There is no experiment that has supported MacArthur's idea that doubling the fuel load doubles the rate of spread. We know it isn't true. But this is the theory that underpins how we do fire management. This is the theory that is run in big models like Phoenix that tells us where we've got to burn across the country. It gets dressed up in nice pieces of software, but it's still those 9 data points. And you see, the thing is, on the left, I've got 10 sheets of paper burning, and on the right, I've got 5 sheets of paper, half the fuel load. Why is the flame bigger? You can see why it's bigger, because it's aerated and because the heat moves upward and it spreads up quickly. There's no room for that in this idea that it's just about the fuel load. So the structure of things, the way it's arranged, makes all the difference, because in the natural world, fire does the same thing. It spreads upwards through plants. And it doesn't matter what the weight of those leaves is. What matters is that it's able to jump from branch to branch and get up through that forest there. And so more recent experiments, the Project Vesta experiments in Western Australia, it's kind of seen as the gold standard. They've come out saying it is not about the weight of the fuel, it's about the height and the cover of the understory. This is not new information. People have known this stuff forever, but now we've got science to show it. I showed this in 2016 mechanistically, but this is showing it empirically. Remember the difference between those two different things. So I'll look at a little bit of what I've shown. I call my stuff ecological control theory, which is basically how did they survive since Gondwana without us here to save them from themselves? So how did we get here? And that's been described by Professor David Bowman as the pipe dream that forests can magically, ecologically self-organise to become bushfire-proof. It's a beautiful thought, but that's not real. So thanks, David. Now, back in a few years ago, I was in Tassie in the Huon Valley, and there's this area on the top you can see a patch of young regrowth forest, and on the bottom, that's the original forest just outside of the logging coupe. And what I didn't know was that at the same time, David Bowman's team were doing work in that forest, and what they found was that not only when the 2019 fires came through there, not only did they burn much more severely in that top screen than in the bottom, 98% of the fire edge stopped in the bottom screen, not the top, which I would say that's a less flammable environment down the bottom. Again, looking up in the top end, it's not just wet forests. Up in the top end, again, Bowman's research, they're looking at this calitris community, and what he found was this: the denser the canopy cover of Calitris intratropica, fires just couldn't burn into it. You got a denser cover, and the distance that fire could burn in there just dropped off dramatically, so that by the time you got 80% cover, you got about 10% as likelihood of fire burning through that patch there. It's stopping 90% of the fires. So, the question is, how did those trees magically organise from being little ones into being big ones? What's the magic involved in that? And, the pipe dream of a forest becoming less likely to burn. How does that happen? We can see how it happens. Plants grow. And there's this thing called succession. And what that looks like, stay with me here. If you get a lot of shrubs, you get a lot of flames. We're still on the same page so far. Stop me if I'm getting too complicated. The plants in the background, the trees, aren't burning, but they're involved in that fire because they're slowing the wind speed down underneath them. So it's a stronger wind above those trees than it is down below. The more vegetation you've got up there slowing the wind, the slower the fire is. The more vegetation you've got down here feeding the fire, the faster it is. So vegetation can either feed a fire or calm a fire, depending on whether it's down there or up there. Give it some time and those shrubs turn into mid-story plants that outcompete the plants underneath them. They thin out like the shrubs around Wadbilliga, and you end up with the mid-story now calming the forest down as well. It's a simplified picture, but it's something I've studied in quite a lot of depth, both empirically and mechanistically. It's also something that we have observed over many years, where this is a basic principle that I mentioned before, the Ray-Spect principle. It's also something that the Inspector General of Australian Forests highlighted right back in 1939. He said the reason we had the Black Friday fires in 1939 and the reason the bush is flammable is because people are burning it. And if we stop burning that forest, that understory will clear out. And it wasn't just foresters like him. There's the Rogers family up at Walgolmarang who were, running stock up there for 100 years. And they said, yeah, we burned it all the time and we made the bushfire problem. We can see that we did that stuff. And then there's empirical studies like this work out of Melbourne Uni that has shown that when you look at the trends right across South Australia and Victoria, understories get thinner if you keep fire out of them. It's not a niche thing, it's a thing that happens really widespread. It's basic ecology. And what it gives us is a trend like this, where you can start out with a forest that most of the vegetation is up the top, so there's green in that little inset picture because it's slowing the fire down. If you burn that forest, you remove the last bit of vegetation down the bottom, so now there's only stuff slowing the fire, and you've reduced the flammability. And then straight after that, you get that forest increasing again. You get the shrubs regrowing. And now you can get to a point where those shrubs are so big that they can even catch the canopy on fire. So the canopy's not slowing the fire down anymore. Now the canopy is becoming more likely to become part of a crown fire. But the good news is that if you leave it alone, the forest will eventually return to its original state. And so this is the timeline that we see in theory from the mechanisms. But when we measure it in practice, as I did across, I think it was 65 million points that I measured across the full mapped fire history over the Alps, over all of these different forest types, every single fire interaction that we'd seen, every forest had that same trend. You burn it and you produce this pulse of increased flammability, increased likelihood of fire. David Lindenmeyer, Chris Taylor and others measured this during the Black Summer fires around the Sydney, Blue Mountains, Illawarra area. We know that crown fires only happen in country that's been burnt in the last 30-odd years. Again, more work from the 2009 Black Saturday fires. Exactly the same trend. This is why David and I now work together, because we discovered we'd independently found the same shaped graph, and we're both nerds. So here's the thing though. See that little rectangle up the top left? You'd wonder, why is it that if we see this stuff so clearly, this is not making it into mainstream management? And the reason is that little triangle there, rectangle there. It's the, I am a mathematician, I promise. It's the smoke and mirrors window. You only look within that patch. You say, the burns that happened just really recently helped to stop fires, but at the other side of that rectangle, the fires were hard to control, and you ignore everything out of that. You make it look as if the burns are the solution when they're actually the thing that caused the hump. So in WA, for example, those Project Vesta experiments examined 22 years of different ages of Jarrah forest, and they showed that as you got older, you got faster spreading fires, and that's what they reported. But they also knew that exactly at 22 years, that's when the shrubs thin, because it had been published by their colleague just a few years before then. And so you got the magical smoke and mirrors rectangle there, giving you one answer that is the opposite to reality. I went back and I looked at all of their records, and what I found with my colleagues was that it wasn't a perfect fit, but still in the older forests, you got less fire. I did the same sort of analysis as I'd done for the Alps. More fire right in that regrowth period in the middle, less fire in the oldest forests. They came back saying, look, you should get rid of the oldest records because they're a little bit faulty. And you see how the argument's sneaking in, because they said exactly at 35 years, get rid of all of the older data. They said our records are crap after 35 years. And I said, well, by your criteria, it's only 1.6% of those records. So what if I just get rid of those? And when I did that, it happened that it came back and fit perfectly with the expected trend from the shrubs. So this is how scientists fight. So you look at this parliamentary inquiry into Victoria's fires, which has said, look, they had prescribed burns that were critical to stopping bushfires around Lorne. It's not a study though. This is testimony from the Victorian government about their policy. Trust us, our policy worked really, really well. They looked over at the Walwa fire, and they made the same claim. Now it just happens that I looked at that fire as well, and it had all of this prescribed burning within the last 10 years. All of these coloured polygons were burns that happened within the last 10 years. And yet still, even with that, you got a fire tornado. On a day that was, it was hot, but it wasn't wild and windy. How did that happen? When you had a burn like that, here's back from my 2018 study, you had a 2025 burn. That was helpful. I believe him. It was helpful. I met with Chris Hardman today, and I agree. That was helpful. But the rest of his burns were there. See the smoke and mirrors rectangle coming back in again. They had primed that country for crown fire, which created that fire tornado. So if you only focus on the really short-term effects and exclude all of the long-term bad effects, you exclude what is happening, because those burns replaced long unburnt country that wouldn't have burnt, and they made a fire tornado. So how do we go ahead from this? The first thing we need to do, look, I talk too much and I will skip through some of this, but there is some really bad thinking in the economics of this, of people saying, look, we can save money per hectare If we spend less per hectare, don't put out as many firefighters, that sort of thing. There's this argument coming. They said, the bigger the operation, the bigger the fire, the less it costs per hectare. And that's true. This was one of my remote teams some years ago. It costs a lot to send out a helicopter with a few of us just for a little fire like that. It costs a lot to winch us in to put out an individual burning tree. If you spread that out per hectare, it's a big price. But what we also know is that the whole fire costs a whole lot less. You catch it while it's small and it costs less. And we know this from international numbers. The more you spend per hectare, the less you spend on the fire all up. The more you spend per hectare, the smaller the fire is. So if we shift away from really rapid attack into these low-cost approaches, then what we do is, we save money per hectare, but we pay more in total. But here's the other thing these numbers are missing. They are not showing the cost of your house being burnt down. They're showing the cost of firefighting. That cost is externalised onto you, onto your insurance bills, it's externalised onto wildlife, it's externalised onto the climate, which means it's fiddling the books. So, is it too late? Judge Stretton thought it might be too late. He could see we had created the problem by burning the bush back in 1939, and he said, there's a lot of country that is dense regrowth. That horse is bolted. All we can do is keep burning it. In my opinion, that is defeat. If we say that, then we're just saying that's the end of those forests. We are giving up on those forests. So I actually ran the numbers for the WA situation. He called it a cycle of destruction that can't be arrested in our day. When I ran those numbers for WA, where I've done most of this analysis, I compared it with a mild climate change projection to 2100 and a worst case scenario. And what I showed was in the green line on the bottom, that's if you stop the broad scale burning and you focus back in on rapid attack and suppression, you can immediately cut out nearly half of the fire, which is escape prescribed burns and fires made larger by backburns. And the whole way through, even by 2100 under a worst case climate scenario, you can have less wildfire than you have today. It's possible there. I haven't run the numbers for here, but I'm hopeful. I think we can still claw our way back out of this. So, yes, I'll leave it with that.
Wow, thank you so much, Phil. That was information rich, and very glad to hear that you're not a defeatist and you're in good company here. This is a room full of people who are not defeatists. We are fighting the good fight, and we like to spread information about evidence base for choosing political policies, environmental policies, climate policies, and we will be using some of that valuable information you've shared with us when we come to do our scorecard for the coming state election. I'd like to now introduce our next speaker, or invite Natalie to come up and share her expertise with us as well. Thanks.
Cool. Thanks so much, Julia, and thank you to the Lighter Footprints Committee for organising tonight. It's great to see so many people come out to talk about forest protection. And to Phil, thank you for such an engaging presentation. Science is definitely not my strong suit, so I always appreciate when you make it so accessible for people like me. So I'll also acknowledge that we're all gathering tonight on Wurundjeri country. I'll also acknowledge that Victoria's forests are living cultural landscapes. For thousands of generations, First Peoples have maintained deep responsibilities to country and culture through systems of knowledge, governance, and care that continue today. And as we've heard, treaty processes are underway in the state, and decisions about the future of Victoria's forests must be informed by and developed in partnership with traditional owners. So just a bit of an overview. I'm broadly going to cover what's happened in the forest space in Victoria in recent years and how we got to this point, what needs to happen now, and what's coming next and what's on the horizon. I also want to start by mentioning a report that Environmental Justice Australia published in June called Following the Money, the Unfinished Transition Away from Native Forest Logging. And that piece of work was led by EJ's brilliant forest campaigner Luke Chamberlain, who many of you know. And it coincided with the airing of the Four Corners program on native forest logging in Australia. And if you haven't seen it, I would recommend. The report, EJ's report, is about 55 pages, so we've got a couple of copies up the back, but I would recommend accessing the electronic version via the QR code. And if I have to wrap up and don't get to speak about everything tonight, there's a good chance that it's all in the report, so I would recommend having a look. The purpose of that report essentially was to look at whether Victoria's so-called transition away from native forest logging achieved what it set out to do, including how the $1.5 billion in transition funding was spent. In April this year, the Victoria Auditor General's Office also published a report that audited the forest transition program and how that was being delivered and whether it was supporting workers, businesses and communities as intended. So together, those two reports really provide quite a comprehensive analysis of what the transition has, or maybe more importantly, hasn't achieved. So, start with what's happened. I won't spend too much time on this because I think a lot of people in the room are very well across this, but this slide is part one of the timeline that shows the years that preceded the announcement to end native forest logging 6 years earlier than planned. So we can see from the timeline there are litigation outcomes, there are catastrophic bushfires, commercial decisions. All of these things led to the government's announcement in 2023 to end native forest logging in 2024 instead of 2030 as planned. And so that announcement was in May, so 3.5 years ago, and it included a commitment to deliver the largest expansion to the state's reserve system in history to protect biodiversity and threatened species. In the same media release, the government also announced that they'd be setting up an advisory panel to consider and make recommendations on areas of the 1.8 million hectares of native forest that were previously managed for logging, to see which areas qualified for protection as national parks, areas that would be suitable for recreational opportunities and for management by traditional owners. So these were the promises that were made 3.5 years ago. Since then, we can see in the what's ended column on the slide that some legislative and policy changes followed that announcement. It included winding up Vic Forest, the state-owned logging agency, in 2024, repealing the Sustainable Forest Timber Act, which housed the legal framework under which Vic Forest operated, and the end of Victoria's regional forest agreements, the RFAs. And the end of the RFAs was significant because it meant that immediately logging on private land became subject to federal oversight and assessment. There is a lot, however, in the what remains category, and this is what I'm going to spend most of the time talking about tonight. That's because the reality is it's 2.5 years after what was supposed to be the end of native forest logging in Victoria, and it's also $1.5 billion later. And still, none of the 1.8 million hectares of forest that was previously managed for logging has been permanently protected. Native forest is still being logged, and native forest wood is still being transported and processed by Victorian companies and infrastructure. This is really continuing through a range of different regulatory loopholes. That includes private land logging, salvage logging, fire management, and the importation of native forest wood from other logging states, specifically Tasmania and New South Wales. And while these categories of activities are not unlawful, they do ultimately undermine the transition in Victoria away from native forest logging and create an incentive for continued reliance on native forest wood in this state. Given the extent of the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis in this state and nationwide, it's critical that the environmental impacts associated with native forest logging and retaining carbon stores is not simply shifted from some native forests to other native forests. So in this context, EJ's Follow the Money report made 5 key recommendations. They were that governments permanently protect Victoria's native forests, close logging loopholes, improve transparency and accountability for transition funding, apply the lessons from Victoria in Tasmania and New South Wales, and end the federal government's support for native forest logging. So when we talk about legal loopholes, what we mean is gaps in legislation, legislative instruments and policy that leaves the door open for current logging that's happening now and the return of a Vic Forest style model. So as I said before, we're talking about logging on private land, fire management activities, salvage logging, forest produce licences and interstate supply chains. So just zooming in briefly on a few of those. Unlike logging conducted by Vic Forest on public land, logging on private land in Victoria continues under a separate planning and legislative framework, which essentially means we have inconsistent rules across different land tenures, which is resulting in the continued fragmentation of habitat and reduction in habitat connectivity for threatened species. And in some cases, we've seen logging happening on private property with planning permission that was granted decades earlier. For example, EJA is currently representing wildlife of the Central Highlands in a case in VCAT that involves a permit that was granted in 1977. Threatened species, of course, do not recognise land boundaries, and the reality is that environmental impacts are being shifted elsewhere rather than avoided. We've also heard local councils express concern about the lack of resourcing and capacity to regulate these types of commercial operations. Forest produce licences is another mechanism that still exists in the legislation under the Forest Act, and these are essentially licences that can be granted to remove timber from state forests. And in April 2026, the Department of Environment published a policy which refers to using forest produce licences for small-scale niche industry. However, it's a policy, it's not binding. The legislation is very broad and really does leave the door open for large-scale logging operations to continue under those provisions. And in fact, before 2004, when Vic Forests came into being, forest produce licences were the main mechanism facilitating logging in Victoria, and those provisions have not been amended. Fire management. In April this year, the department published another policy, or the Victoria's State Forest Byproducts Framework, which states that the department will sell high-quality timber from its forest and fire management activities to sawmills, which is particularly concerning because ultimately this could create an incentive to continue clearing native forests, and this is also being undertaken with no independent oversight. So, how do we address some of these gaps? So like many folks in the room, I'm sure EJ engaged in the Great Outdoors Task Force process, which is the advisory panel set up to decide what happens to the 1.8 million hectares of forest, and that process has come and gone. But as part of that, we were invited to make a supplementary submission detailing some legislative amendments that would go some way to closing some of these loopholes and gaps. And so I've included some on the slide here, which is a bit dense, but if you want to see the full submission, it is on our website if you're really interested in the legislation. But I think I just wanted to include them to make the point that we're not talking about getting rid of everything, redrafting huge pieces of new legislation. These are quite discrete, targeted amendments that could be made now that would close a lot of these loopholes. So the amendments drafted in that submission were really aimed at clearly reflecting new priorities for land management following the end of the commercial logging industry, introducing new provisions to restrict the sale of native forest wood that's been removed from national parks and state forests, for example, via fire management activities, and updating the broader purposes sections in legislation to remove the focus from managing forests for commercial purposes. So in response, the Great Outdoors Task Force recommended that the Victorian Government change relevant legislation and regulations to prevent the return of large-scale commercial native timber harvesting in state forests, noting that this should not limit traditional owner or the government's forest and fire management activities. Still, we haven't seen any of these amendments in the legislation. So really what this tells us is that we have the solutions. What we need is the political will to follow through. Having said all this, legislative changes are just one step along the way. On the ground, we know that lasting, long-term protections will be achieved via land tenure changes and other mechanisms that already exist in our laws that aren't being utilised. For example, critical habitat determinations and habitat conservation orders under the Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act. So another loophole I wanted to touch on is the import of native forest logs from other logging states, so specifically New South Wales and Tasmania. Unlike some international jurisdictions, Australia does not require comprehensive timber provenance traceability linking native forest logs to mills and processors. However, folks in Victoria, New South Wales and Tasmania have made repeated observations of logs being transported across borders and the Bass Strait, including via publicly available traffic tunnel footage, showing ongoing interstate native forest timber supply to Victoria. So for example, on the slide we have, these are images taken from the Follow the Money report, but the top image, figure 15, shows a logging truck in Hobart. These photos were taken one day apart. The bottom photo is a photo of the same truck entering Powelltown Sawmill in Victoria. And this was covered by the Four Corners program that I mentioned earlier that aired in June. Really, ultimately this raises questions about whether the Victorian government sufficiently tied public funding that was intended to support the transition away from native forest logging to plantations to clear and measurable changes in business activity, i.e. not logging native forests or not bringing in native forest wood anymore. So lastly, what's changing, what's on the horizon, and what are the opportunities? Right now, decisions are being made about the future of native forest logging in Australia as we approach the end of the Regional Forest Agreement exemption in the EPBC Act. The end of the RFA exemption is an opportunity for governments to properly fund and support a transition to a plantation-based industry nationwide, while improving environmental oversight and reducing long-term public financial exposure. Decisions that are made now will show whether the lessons of Victoria's transition are applied or whether similar environmental, legal and financial risks will continue to accumulate and be felt by communities, and not just human communities, of course. Ultimately, there is so much happening in this space. So we've got changes to environmental laws, negotiations that are currently ongoing between governments, elections. It's all opportunities to call for meaningful action. The transition in Victoria is unfinished, and it's time to deliver on promises to support communities and protect native forests. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalie. I imagine everyone like me is just feeling grateful that there are experts like Natalie getting their heads across that complex interplay of federal and state legislation, and my optimistic takeaway is that the solutions are there. If there's political will, we can actually make the legislative changes required to save our native forests. I'm now going to hand over to Ray Peck and Izzy Kerr, who will start the Q&A section. So if you've thought of any questions in the meantime, you can still put them into Slido. Thanks.
Thanks, Julia. Yes, and also you can vote up the existing questions as well, which will influence perhaps the which ones we ask. The first one we'd like to ask is probably directed mostly to you, Phil, I think. In Forestry Australia, which I think is a journal, probably, Dr. Tony Bartlett claimed logging and prescribed burning do not make Australian forests more flammable, citing research. Why is he wrong?
There's a lot of reasons to cover, I suppose, in a short amount of time. He went back to, remember the smoke and mirrors rectangle? That's basically what he's focused on there. He's also focused on the theoretical arguments around it, which come back to the 9 dots on a line there. So essentially, the way these arguments work is that people like myself go through, they show up that this stuff is pseudoscience. We disprove it conclusively. I didn't disprove the 9 dots. That was a series of other scientists who've done that before me, but all of that work has been done. It's been disproved. And so the strategy here is to just go back and bring it up as if nothing's happened. Just keep bringing up the old arguments because most people don't know that they're disproved. And, you know, they're convincing sounding arguments. If there's more fuel on the fire, it should burn better because, you know, that's what we're used to in a fireplace. But a bushfire is not a fireplace. It's not a tidy setup like that. So it's basically just rehashing disproved ideas and using that smoke and mirrors rectangle to exclude the data that disqualifies your argument.
Thanks, Phil.
Cool, thank you. I've got one for Natalie. When governments fail to adequately protect forests and wildlife, what legal avenues are available to communities and where are the biggest gaps in the law?
Such a good question. Obviously, there was a lot of litigation that preceded the decision to end native forest logging early, and I think litigation was cited in that media release by the government in 2023. So clearly had an incredible impact. There were injunctions in large parts of Victoria's forests that meant that they just simply couldn't log anymore. So litigation can be hugely impactful, particularly when there's a lack of political will to bring about meaningful changes. I think currently, it can be really difficult, but logging on private land, for example, the laws are different to the laws that apply on public land. They're weaker in some ways. There's no precautionary principle requirement, for example. There are definitely different challenges in different spaces, but you're always welcome to contact EJ if you have a particular question or idea that you want to inquire about.
Another one for you, Phil. So, if Victoria were to move away from its current reliance on planned burning, what would a genuinely science-based approach to reducing bushfire risk look like?
Yeah. So, a couple of elements to it. The first thing is to put everything into catching fires while they are small. Now, Victoria actually does this quite well compared to the other states. They've got some very good remote area firefighters and with a lot of successes under their belt. But there's no reason that can't be expanded further. So that's the first thing, catch the fires while they're small. The reason why that isn't done at the moment is that people say, well, if we put all of the fires out, then the fuel loads will accumulate. But if that is wrong, if that's not how forests work, then the excuse is gone. So put all of the effort into catching fires while they're small. It ends up, if we put money into that, if we employ more people, get better equipment, bring in new technology. There's drone technology now where we can actually, we can have purpose-built satellites that will pick fires up immediately. We can also send up swarms of drones as a storm front is coming through. In 2003, when the storm front came through on the 8th of January and lit up all of the mountains there, we had to wait for several hours until it was safe to get aircraft up to fly out and see where ignitions had started and what could be done with them. If you put these drones out, they can fly in the storm. And the instant a lightning strike occurs, there's a radio signal from it. You know where it's happened. We've already been doing that for a long time. The drone can fly straight to that ignition there, identify with an infrared camera whether there has been an ignition. And at the same time, you've got a high-flying Hercules over the top of the storm that's carrying other drones called water gliders, which each carry about a tonne of water in them. They are then GPS guided. This technology is all well under development at ANU. These water gliders will fly down, zero in on the tree that's burning and drop that water right around the tree that's burning, contain that until it's safe to get remote crews out there. There's all of this technology in place, but we need to put the investment into using it. And the other thing is that a prescribed burn, even under the arguments of the strongest proponents, doesn't help you contain a fire in the middle of nowhere. It only helps you contain a fire if you're putting fire crews on it. So a remote prescribed burn, burning out a 10,000 hectare patch in the middle of nowhere, does nothing, even under the strongest arguments of the proponents. So any treatments should be right up close to where you're actually going to use it. Do it a hose length from the road. And the thing is, lighting fires, that's done as an efficiency thing across a large area. If you're just dealing with those small areas close to roads, then why have the risk of the fire and all of the smoke, which has got a measurable death toll to it? Just send people out with brush cutters and clear the understory close around the houses, that sort of thing. Then we can let those old forests recover. And the final part that I'll add to that, and this is the main area that I'm focusing on, is that because once we know the shape of those curves, then we know what the risk is going to be in these old forests, and we can start using them as fire advantages. We can start actually saying, that's an old wet forest. You don't have to be afraid of the heavy fuel loads in there. It's going to keep the flames small. It's burning because we've broken the climate and made things dry, but you can reinforce that by putting in a sprinkler line. You know, I was talking to Chris Hardman about this today. He said, yeah, we're starting to use them. He said they put in a 15-kilometre long sprinkler line. It's an achievable thing. And so, you know, I'm trying to bend his ear about upscaling. There's ways to do these things.
Thanks, Phil.
Thank you. If current forest fire management Victoria practice is making forests more flammable, why isn't it being challenged in the courts?
Yeah.
Well, we have seen 2 cases in the federal court brought by Save Our Strathbogie Forest and Warburton Environment, challenging the failure to refer planned burns and fuel strategic fire break operations for assessment under the EPBC Act. So all of this, anything that's likely to have a significant impact on a threatened species should be, on a nationally listed threatened species, should be referred for assessment. So we have seen 2 cases, but those cases have been about impacts on greater gliders, leadbeaters, possums. So I don't have a neat answer for you about why there hasn't been a challenge on the basis of flammability. It's a very scientific question, so I think, yeah, that might be a barrier for some.
Yeah. If I can add to that,
yeah,
briefly,
absolutely.
my impression in that Strathbogie case was that everything comes down to your ability to convince one person of something, and it's not necessarily going to be decided on the merits of the science. When you've got all of the funding coming from the agencies who are doing the burning, who are there to promote a government policy, they fund people who are going to help them promote that government policy. And that's not a conspiracy, that's the story of my life. You know, so you've got nearly all of the people working on this are producing things that make it look as if it's working, using this smoke and mirrors approach, using old dodgy models, all of that sort of stuff. But in the end, the judge looks at it and says, you got a room full of professors and a mountain of papers like that, and a ratbag on the other side who says they're all wrong, believe me. And in the end, that's the argument. So.
Good answer.
So I think Warburton Environment has an ongoing case against the Victorian government, in particular forest fire management, led by Chris Hardman, who Phil's been referring to. And you can find more detail from Nick up the back there from Victorian Forest Alliance. We sat in court a number of times. We were shocked at some of the things that were said. Do you count the number of hollow-bearing trees that you cut down? No, they don't. They don't have any idea. They're not interested in that. They're interested in clearing. So when can we expect... It's been such a long time now, Natalie. When can we expect the judge to make a ruling on this, what is known as the Hollows case, I think?
It's a great question. I don't know if Nick has any insights, but yeah, there's no set timeline for these things, unfortunately, so it's just a waiting game.
So in the meantime, forest fire management just continues on with its practice, is that correct?
Yeah, unless there are kind of injunctions in place, which there might be. I'll have to check with Nick. Yeah.
Do you have another? Thanks. Thanks, Nick.
Oh, so there's an undertaking not to cut down any hollow-bearing trees as part of the fire management activities in the Central Highlands, but that doesn't include planned burns. That's correct. Yeah. Yeah.
Someone's asking, if we stop prescribed burns, how do we prepare ourselves for the high risk period over the next decade while extreme temperatures and fire risk only get worse?
Yeah, I mean, that is the big question. And I think I've largely answered that already. It comes down to really finding those fires as quick as possible, catching them while they are small, and preparing close back around houses. And there are parts of the landscape still that are old forests that are still advantages. You know, I was in the Otways yesterday. You hear about the two big fires on the northern side of the Otways. What you don't hear about is the two tiny fires in the long unburnt wet forest because they got put out straight away. So we've still got advantages in the landscape and we can still use these. And so long as we don't have bad advice saying there's been no fire in that country for, you know, my lifetime, therefore it's really dangerous, or we've got to do a huge backburn to burn out that country. That's the stuff we've got to be wary of and protect that country like it's gold.
So, Phil, you have quite a few talks with people in government and forest fire management. Apart from the old ways and the 9-point graph that you referred to, what other reasons might there be for the government not wanting to listen to the new science, your work and David Lindemann, which clearly, if it's less flammable, that approach is less flammable, it's safer, it's less damaging, it's more financially viable in the long run. What other reasons might there be for people in government, ministers perhaps, not to take your work more seriously and make changes?
It's a really complex question because I think a lot of it is social as well. There's a culture where we think like colonisers. We think that there is nothing worse than unmanaged country. We lock up the bush is a bad thing. As if that's what's happening anyway. But this idea that if we are not taking a firm hand, then the bush is just going to get more and more dangerous. That is a widespread viewpoint, and we're probably exceptions in this room because we know and love the bush, but a lot of other people just take that understanding. So there's that cultural perception that it is our job to be in charge, to subdue the earth, to change it all, that sort of thing. Otherwise, it's going to get increasingly dangerous. And if you're not doing anything, and it's just part of human nature. If we're scared, it's somebody do something. I actually heard one of the chief researchers from Melbourne Uni, from the Flare Lab that runs the Phoenix modelling there, say that it is better to do the wrong thing than to do nothing. Like, you said it out loud to a crowd, So there is that mentality. It makes people feel like they've got some level of control. Another part of it is that there's a lot of jobs in there and a lot of people who have done that sort of thing for a long time. You're changing cultures. You're also challenging people who have enormous egos. And men, let me just be clear, it's men. And the answer I get constantly is, I've been doing this since you were in nappies. And, so it doesn't matter what's true. It's, I am recognised as an important person because I have these strong viewpoints on burning the bush. And these people develop a lot of power. So, yeah.
And votes, probably.
And votes, yeah. And you get that sort of stuff into talkback radio. There's a lot of angry people, and a small number of angry people is much more influential than a room full of calm, reasoned people.
Thanks. An Adelaide Uni study found that predators quickly remove small animals killed in planned burns, so surveys often miss them. Is this your experience? What are the implications of this?
Yeah, so most of my work focuses on what makes the bush more or less flammable, but I am more recently starting to look at, fauna like greater gliders. But I am familiar with some of that work from Adelaide University, and yes, I mean it's hard to miss that. Animals are going to come straight in. You see a burn patch, and there's birds circling there. So there's going to be burnt animals disappearing off that very, very quickly. It absolutely stands to reason.
And Natalie, does that mean that if you're going to take that to court, that it's important to get in quickly and do a survey of the damage done? Because that will be evidence, I would think. Yeah, would that be?
I mean, the more evidence, the better that you have for these things. You're never going to be in a position where you kind of have too much. If it's safe, I would cave it. But yeah, absolutely. That's all very persuasive when it's put before a court.
Yep. So, other than the purpose of Indigenous traditions, is there ever a cause for planned burns? Or would you not call cool burning... I'll let you answer the question. You'd probably say they're not the same thing anyway, but you get the gist of the question. Would you want me to repeat it again?
No, I've got the gist, yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's good to clarify that cultural burns and prescribed burns are very, very different things. You're not trying to change the landscape with a cultural burn. It's like a gardening tool. You are altering a specific place. So in WA, for example, I looked at a patch of Chewett woodland where a prescribed burn had just gone around lighting up grass trees, and it had killed 77% of the population of a critically endangered wire, the western ringtail possum there. Because these grass trees are just underneath their hollows and obviously going to kill them. And when I said that to somebody, he said, but First Nations, Noongar mob, burnt that country, burnt those grass trees, how did they do it? Well, they knew that there was a possum there, so they didn't burn that grass tree. That's the scale that you're looking at. So prescribed burns are totally different. Is there a place for any burning in the country? Possibly. It's still a tool that can be used if it's useful for First Nations as a tool for modifying country. There are situations where I look at, say, species of plants that we have cleared nearly all of their distribution. There's a tiny little patch of those plants left on a rocky knoll somewhere, and they're getting old. And we know that when some of them are burnt, they will go to seed. Now, you don't want to burn all of them because then all of your eggs are in one basket. You've killed off the whole population and you've got to get that whole new cohort through. But maybe there is a place for burning a really small bit here and there and just using it like a tool to regenerate that population. But there is no comparison between that and prescribed burning.
Thanks. On that, can we have your 30-second elevator pitch that we can take away when spreading the word about how our forest fire management should change?
That's a good one. Yeah.
Forests have been doing this since Gondwana. They survived for all of that time without us here to save them from themselves. So we need to find out how forests work and get alongside them and stop fighting them. And the way we do that at the moment is to start winding back the impact that we've got, start undoing our impact. That means letting forests recover back to their original mature state, catching fires while they're small, and reversing that trend of increasing fire frequency.
What about Natalie?
And not logging them, I guess.
Yes. Yeah, also cut them all down.
Yeah. Yep.
If
Ideally.
you bulldoze them, also bad.
Yep.
Well, we both think that's a good place to finish the questions. So I understand you have some gifts now? No, that comes after the gifts, surely. Doesn't it? Well, don't these guys want to see the video?
Okay, you've all got to stick around till the end now because we've got a fantastic video surprise for you. But first up, I'm Sarah Hegarty. I'm the co-convener of Lighter Footprints. And so it's my job to say on behalf of Lighter Footprints a tremendous thank you to Phil and Natalie. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us tonight. That has been an incredibly powerful presentation. I think we can all take away a lot of insights from that, especially going into the state election season coming up. So thank you so much for coming, especially all the way from New South Wales, Phil. Amazing. We've got a tiny, tiny token of our appreciation to share with you. Just a little lovely jar of some organic honey to say we really appreciate hearing from you. And before Julia and Ray sneak off the stage, I'm going to keep them here for just a moment. Julia, Ray, Sarah Brennan, Izzy, Jean, and our wonderful folk, oh yeah, of course, in the Lighter Footprints Forests Working Group are the masterminds behind this evening. They have organised the whole thing and done an incredible job. So I'd just like to get a round of applause for our Forests Working Group.
I've got to talk first.
Well, shall I finish my bits? Or
No.
Okay, you can finish. All right. I won't do my lovely segue. You've got the video surprise now, folks.
But you stay here, though.
I'll stay here.
Unless you want to watch it and come back up.
Let me just check that the sound is on. We'll find out. Okay, so speaking of the amazing work of our Forests Working Group, their convener Sarah Brennan has organised. I'll let you go.
Yes, we're now going to play you a brief video of Bob Brown speaking about his view of what's needed for native forest protection. But it's important you note these are Bob's views. Lighter Footprints is not aligned with any political party. What we do is aim to persuade every member of each political party or organisation for the need to protect nature strongly and take action to mitigate and adapt to climate change.
G'day, Bob Brown here, and I wish I was over there with you because I love the Victorian forest. Who wouldn't? They're an icon not just for Victoria and Australia, but the whole world. Somewhere over there, over a century ago, was the tallest flowering tree in the world and the tallest tree ever recorded on Earth. But it's been blitzed. What's great is that people are now campaigning to keep what's left. And they're campaigning against the odds, against the Labor Party, against the 3 right-wing parties, against a whole big corporate establishment backing the logging industry. But the polls show that 80% of Australians want our forests protected. That's because they want the wildlife protected as well. The koalas, the black cockatoos, leadbeater's honeyeater, that little leadbeater's possum, which is the faunal emblem of Victoria, once thought extinct, but now back, hanging on, because the forests are hanging on, and because people are hanging on to the idea that they should be protected. Where is the Great Forest National Park that Labor said would be implemented? How come they've gone to water over it? Well, it's just so wonderful that there are people campaigning for it. There's an election coming up. That can change the odds. I think it will change the odds. There's going to be a different parliament after that election in November. And there's Greens, Independents and other people who are going to make the stand for the forests and are going to fight for the forests in the parliament, which in a democracy is the place where decisions are made, not just by the government, but by the parliament. Give those folk balance of power in either, or better, both houses of parliament, and there'll be a stand for what's left of Victoria's magnificent forests and for a Great Forest National Park, but really the protection of all the forests that are left. That means better water, that means more wildlife, that means cleaner air, that means a hedge against global warming, and that means keeping our spirit and our hearts with the forests from which we come. All strength to you forest campaigners. May the next few months go brilliantly for Victoria's forests.